main conclusion is, well, I guess I've reached two major conclusions. The first major conclusion is neither side won the conflict. I don't like to call it a war because it didn't really have too many it had some characteristics of a war, but it also had some characteristics of a massacre. So I'll call it the hostilities. Neither side came out the victor in the hostilities. And the second major conclusion I would reach from what happened is that the Palestinians, in this case Hamas, but the people in Gaza in general, have to radically rethink a strategy which, even though it has successfully stopped the Israeli killing machine, that's correct, it has successfully halted the Israeli killing machine, it has not successfully achieved any positive gains for the people of Gaza. In effect, we're right back to the same old ceasefire, which has a clause about lifting the siege, but the clause will never be put into effect.
But on the other side, Israelis went with a declared goal of obliterating Hamas, of obliterating the tunnels, of preventing Hamas from waging any attacks by missiles or projectiles against Israel, and they failed on all these fronts.
That's absolutely correct.
And in the Middle East history, whenever a guerrilla force manages to make Israel, to bring it to a stalemate or to cul-de-sac, then they consider themselves winners, because here there are no matching forces. The issue is if they can sustain and stay put facing all that, then they consider themselves winners.
Well, look, there's a big difference between whether they consider themselves winners and whether they actually are winners. And we have to look objectively at the situation. What we have now is a return to the status quo ante. The agreement that was reached, the ceasefire agreement, we don't know the exact terms, but they're pretty clear. The terms of the ceasefire agreement basically return us to what the agreement that was signed after Operation Pillar of Defense.
Never respected the agreement of ceasefire.
Yeah, but that's the whole point. There's no evidence that this new agreement is going to be respected. All the evidence points to the fact that it's simply going to be a return to the status quo ante. That is the situation before Operation Protective Edge. Now, it is true that Israel did not win. I have no doubt about that. But
and they know if they come back, there will be a very
but the status quo, the status quo ante is tolerable for Israel. Israel can live with a Hamas controlling Gaza. The status quo ante is not tolerable for the people of Gaza because it means the siege has not yet been lifted. And so even though Israel's killing machine was stopped dead in its tracks, which, as I said, in my opinion is a correct evaluation, it doesn't mean that the people of Gaza have achieved any positive gains. They have the negative gain of stopping Israel. But as you recall, the whole purpose of the Hamas resistance, which it announced immediately as the hostilities broke out, their purpose was to lift the siege. There is no evidence.
But it is not Hamas who waged this war.
I know
on the receiving end.
I'm quite aware of that. I do not believe that Hamas instigated the conflict. There's no evidence of that. But to come out at the end where you started, after having said the goal was a ceasefire plus lifting the siege, that's not a victory. It's true that it was at the popularity level. It was a victory for Hamas. It's true that the stock of the Palestinian Authority plummeted. We don't have any dispute about that.
And the Israeli coalition.
Yes, and it's also true that there was a lot of disappointment, and more than disappointment, in Israel at the result of the latest hostilities. But the problem is you get so caught up in what I would consider tangential side issues or secondary issues that you forget that there is an overarching political goal. What do you want to achieve? As I understand it, and you can correct me, the people in Gaza have a short-term goal. They want the siege to end. The siege that's been going on for 7 years since Hamas came to control Gaza in late 2007. They want that siege to end. That's their middle or short-term goal. Their long-term goal is, along with the people in the West Bank, to end the occupation by Israel. So, since that's their overarching goals, you have to ask the question, not whether Hamas's popularity surged or the Palestinian Authority's popularity plummeted, not whether the Israelis are happy or unhappy with the outcome. You have to ask the basic question, what was accomplished in terms of the goals?
Well, we can hear that Hanan Ashrawi, when she came to the United Nations a few days ago, she was more emboldened. She wanted a timeline for the independence. She wanted that from the Obama administration, from the United Nations. They are in the process of putting forward a strong argument for independence and resolving the final issues.
You're much too serious an individual to take this sort of nonsense seriously.
No, I'm not taking it
seriously. The United Nations on its own, is not going to do anything.
Of course, it's not.
But
the Palestinians now have higher voice.
They have.
What happened in Gaza?
They do not have a higher voice. I'm writing now a little book, not just on what happened in Gaza in the past, during those 51 days, but the whole period beginning with 2006, the victory of Hamas in the parliamentary elections, and then Cass-led, then the Mavi Marmara, then Operation Pillar of Defense, and now Operation Protective Edge. I look at all four, and you know what's the most striking? And I have to admit, I was surprised when I reread what I wrote in those years. After each one of those events, the Palestinian profile was higher. Have you forgotten that after Israel attacked the Mavi Marmara, there was the big outcry when all the world leaders were saying that the blockade of Gaza was unsustainable, that the blockade had to be lifted? Have you forgotten the Security Council passed Resolution 1860 saying it had to be lifted? And then it has a high profile, and then it disappears.
But what is the difference in this time? What happened in Gaza recently, for the first time, we've seen the Palestinians with the Israelis face to face, and as you said yourself in your recent writings, that the casualties among the Israelis on soldier level was very high. The Palestinians were not targeting civilians as the West or Western media saying that these tunnels were meant to go and capture civilians and slaughter civilians, to go to schools, to go nurseries. This has not happened. No, there was a fair confrontation, an honorable one, and they have achieved a lot, 4 times, 5 times more than in the previous
I perfectly well recognize that more Israeli combatants were killed this time than in the past, that on a strictly military level, which is not my cup of tea, I'm not a military analyst, I don't care for death as just a matter of principle. It doesn't appeal to me, so I'm not interested so much in wars. But I recognize, yes, it's true that this time, many times more Israeli combatants were killed. But one
but
one has to be realistic about these things. You have to go back and look at history. Israel has withdrawn twice from territories it occupied. It withdrew from the Egyptian Sinai beginning with the Camp David Framework Agreement in 1977, and then the actual 1978, and then the actual agreement 1979. But that only came after the 1973 war, when Israel lost between, we don't know the exact numbers, between 2,000 and 3,000 soldiers. That was a huge blow to Israel. And after that defeat, and it didn't suffer a defeat, but it suffered a real blow. Yes, then it reconsidered before 73, the famous line by Israeli defense minister and then foreign minister Moshe Dayan was, we prefer Sharm el-Sheikh without peace to peace without Sharm el-Sheikh. Namely, we're not withdrawing from the Sinai, we'd rather have Sharm el-Sheikh without peace. After the 73 war, 2,000 to 3,000 casualties, they rethink, we're going to leave. We can't afford this anymore. And the second time they withdrew was from Lebanon. But in Lebanon, it took a very long, protracted guerrilla war, lasting approximately 20 years, with a very sophisticated guerrilla army, which had open borders with allies, which was able to supply it with quite sophisticated weaponry, and they imposed many hundreds of casualties on Israel before it finally decided in 2000, May 2000, to withdraw. There's no possibility. I'm not speaking right or wrong, moral or immoral. I'm just speaking.
The Palestinians this time
there's
managed
no.
to close Benghazi
We're
airport.
talking about 64 casualties. We have to be realistic about these things. Yes, it was more than Israel has experienced. Yes, it's true that the Palestinians made a better showing on the battlefield, but is it realistic?
But there is a cumulative pattern here, which is, I mean, in every conflict, the might of the
Nizar, it may be cumulative, but we're a long, long way from quantity. We're a long, long way from quantity turning into quality.
Yes.
We can go from 10 casualties in Operation Cast Lead to 64 casualties, Israeli casualties, in Operation Protective Edge. But we're a long way. You have to, Nizar.
Remember that
Nizar,
1996, sorry to interrupt.
Nizar, I know you. You're a very smart guy, and you follow politics with a hawk's eye. I know you. You have to look at the balance sheet at the end. Yes, it was 64 casualties. No doubt, we don't disagree. Did it extract any political gain? Political in terms of the goals that were set. Did it extract any gain in terms of the goals that were set? The original agreement, ceasefire ultimatum proposed by Sisi, the Egyptian so-called president, called for a ceasefire without lifting the blockade. Hamas rejected it because it wants the blockade lifted. We are now 2,200 dead Palestinians later, Gaza reduced to rubble, pulverized. Right. Now, I am not diminishing the resistance, the indomitable will of the people of Gaza. I'm simply saying let's be objective and sober